All right. Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Graham. With me today is Kevin Klinkenberg of Kansas City, Missouri. He is an urban designer and the host of the outstanding Messy Cities podcast. I encourage y'all to check that out on Messy Cities. Kevin tends to explore topics relating to real estate, urbanism, architecture, particularly with a bent toward human scale and human scale development. He has interviewed some outstanding guests, names that if that is something that you're really interested in, you'll probably recognize would be Eric Kronberg very recently, Charles Marone of Strong Towns, Aaron Lubeck, friend of Yeoman. We've had Aaron on, and Joe Minicozy. Big fan. I'm a big fan of the work of all those people, so I would encourage you to go over to Messy Cities and check those things out. So welcome, Kevin. Glad to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Jeff.
I'm delighted to be with you. I wanted to start by reading a tweet that you wrote. I think now it's probably a couple months ago. And I'll just read it and we'll dive in from there. And I'll for brevity, I'll paraphrase a little bit at the beginning. But you write, scale and localization of management are the least sexy, perhaps the most important topics we never talk about. Seems to me that bigness has been a major problem in American governance and management, whether we're talking about cities, schools, policing, higher ed, etc. Bigness leads to silos, layers of middle management, and lots of hidden expense. Most importantly, too much distance from the people you're ostensibly serving. Localization and decentralization from a management standpoint breeds interdisciplinary solutions, attention to detail, and responsiveness to people. Too often we blame problems on bad people when what we really have are bad systems. Subsidiarity, human scale, these are two recurring themes here on Yeoman. So I'm excited to explore that topic with you. And I'm sure kicking off with that topic, it'll lead into others. But my first question is can you recall what prompted that tweet?
Well, I suppose it's been a bit of a years-long obsession of mine that continues to pop up from time to time. I have a sense that probably what happened there was something related to schools and schooling and thinking about that. But, I have probably one of the weirdest professional resumes of just about anybody that I know. And originally educated as an architect and spent a lot of my career doing urban planning, urban design work, and very deep in the new urbanist world. And at one point in about 2003, I'll get back to this. This is going to be like a long and winding way to get back to talking about this topic. But about 2003, I received one of the fellowships that through the night program in community building through the University of Miami. That was something that was put together by Liz Plater-Zyberk when she was the dean there. And it was a program that lasted, I think, for about 6 years. And there were a number of us who became fellows. And there were a lot of things that stuck with me. We each had to pick a project as our fellowship project. And then we spent a lot of time together with Liz, with other faculty, et cetera. And Liz was the first person who kind of clued me into this way of thinking that she talked about the three pillars of community building. And she talked about them as design, policy, and management. And broadly speaking, that if you really want to improve your community, you have to think about all three areas, all three of those areas. And obviously, as new urbanists and as architects and all, we love the design aspect. And I think new urbanists really demonstrated the power of good design very, very effectively. There's a ton of people who work in the policy world. And I would argue that there's way too much emphasis generally on policy, and too many smart people who focus on policy as opposed to projects. But hardly anybody really talks about management and what are the systems in place that enable something to happen and enable to be effective for a long period of time. And from the standpoint of thinking about like cities, we're often, I'll take an example of, like a project in my city. In the 1990s, there was this is probably a super common story, a great effort to rebuild a waterway through the heart of the city called Brush Creek. And there was a fantastic effort to redesign it, rebuild it, and to make it a great civic amenity. And so a lot of work went into the policy and the design aspects to make that happen. And they did create a pretty beautiful amenity at the end result of all of it. But nobody really thought about how was this going to be managed over time. And as a result, it just isn't managed, and then it decays and it degrades. And the experience of trying to enjoy that amenity gets wiped away because there's not a lot of good thought to how that gets maintained over time. That's just a very simplistic example, but
sure.
The reality is what I work in a field now. So I worked in architecture and urban design for a long time. And for the last 5 years, I've really done work in what's called place management. And these are the organization that I am the executive director for, called Midtown KC now, really has responsibility for a small part of the overall city that I live in. And we work to try to help this area develop and improve. And then we also manage 3 self-taxing districts. So in Missouri, those are called community improvement districts. Most states call them business improvement districts. But they're basically defined areas where people agree to raise their taxes voluntarily for specific sets of services, like generally as clean and safe programs. And so we have a little bit of our own money that we raise through this to impact public space. And when you enter that world, it gives you a lot of deep connection into how cities are managed day to day and how they're not managed day to day. And it's been a hell of an interesting education for me to, in a large municipality, to see it and understand the things that work or don't work and why that is. And so I think what has grown out of that has reinforced inclinations that I've had for many years, that a big part of the problem we have in cities and in local government and schools is the size of the effort that we're trying to manage. And if I go back to that night fellowship program, the actual project that I took on then was to look at school standards, school design standards, and essentially kind of write up a report and a summary about all that. Mm-hmm. And that was my first bit of understanding that the way that we see schools, public schools built today, has been impacted by a certain idea of how things should be to have proper functioning of schools that really is all about bigness. And so I know you've talked here before about the famous Earl Butz quote related to agriculture about, go big or get out.
I was literally just writing down Earl Butz and wanted to come back to
that. But the same thinking went into school design and management in the 20th century. And we went through a decades-long wave of school consolidation in both urban and rural areas that dramatically changed the relationship that people have to their public schools.
Do you know the timeline for that? Like when?
I wish I could give it to you better. I think the first wave probably started, in the pre-World War II era, but like a lot of things didn't really kick in until well after the war. And then I, as a young person, I certainly remember, I grew up in a couple of fairly small towns in rural areas in the Midwest, but I certainly remember how all of the really small towns around us were losing their schools. Those schools were being shut down, and they were being consolidated into our town where the county seat was. And I remember
That's
at the
in
time,
the late 70s, do you think?
that was in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And it was controversial. People were really upset. All these little villages and towns, that elementary school / middle school or whatever was the heartbeat of that community. But there was such an ideology around bigness for education that it just kind of proceeded ahead, no matter what. And so I've been a little obsessed with this issue of scale and bigness of civic institutions and government for a while now. And part of it's because I just don't think we talk about it very much. We even as designers, we've kind of had this naive idea that we can just design like a beautiful place and then we hand it off and it all just magically works. But the same thinking that went into kind of reinventing how we design and plan our communities, we really need more people to put attention to how we manage those communities as well.
It is, I've probably brought it up a few times here, but I have a great deal of affinity for the new urbanist movement. And there have been, as you say, some enormous successes there. I felt like since its earliest days, generally there was not a great deal of appreciation within the movement for questions about scale. And we talked about building a human scale environment, but human scale systems was not really part of that discussion. And it did seem to be, though I think this is less the case now, seem to be kind of a prescriptive. There are a lot of prescriptive elements in the movement rather than that were still a bit central plannery in the same way as the early modernists, and not very much attention given to concepts like subsidiarity and small scale emergent and responsive systems. That's pretty archibabbly talk right there. Yeah. But that has been a kind of a beef of mine with new urbanism, and I say that in sort of an affectionate way because I guess the movement has been so effective in getting people to rethink the form of our built environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I'm right there with you. And I think from early on, certainly the first wave or two of urbanism was in many ways just to demonstrate that humans were capable of producing beautiful places again, beautiful walkable places.
Yeah.
And that was incredibly successful. And it's
interesting too, like it was when it was done, the only developers doing it were sort of radical, small boutique developers. So by the very nature of what they built, they tended to be, tended to and crafted small scale communities. And then as the movement has gained influence, for a period of time, projects got to be of larger and larger and larger scale. Yeah. And I'd say that some of those have begun losing their that's harsh. I was going to say losing their soul a bit, but that's harsh. That's an overstatement of where they are. But I still think the really best things that are being done that would be called new urbanism are of smaller scale.
I think to be charitable, I think there's an awful lot of that first generation work that was pretty remarkable and incredible and happened through the sheer force of like personality and perseverance. And in a world where everything was hostile to new urbanism. So the successes we had are pretty amazing. And I think as a movement that was started mostly by architects and designers, it's only natural that we would focus on the design and the visual aspects. And then when we started getting into codes, like with form-based codes, it really was a product of that visual aspect. And so at a certain point that there was a change, a little bit of recognition that, maybe there was also something else behind this when you start to look to older cities and towns and how they actually developed, and more of an understanding of what the process was that got them to that place. And that's probably not going to happen with, master plan community tools that we use.
Can you elaborate a bit on that? What do you...
I mean, honestly, I think probably the most interesting time period for all that was when the recession hit, when the financial crisis hit. And Andreas, among others, started talking about lean urbanism as an idea. We had hit a point where the new urbanism had a lot of success, but was also courting big developers, big corporations to try to get them to redo what they were doing. And then the financial crisis hits and everything kind of comes to a stop. And it helped certain people kind of take a step back and think about, well, how did these places organically get constructed, even if we went just back like 150 years ago? There was a lot more investigation into thinking about the difference between planning and micromanaging development, and the difference in mindset, I guess, as much as anything, between having everything figured out ahead of time, every detail perfectly designed, and allowing places to evolve naturally. And I feel like around 2008 to 10, that's when we started to see more of that type of thinking. And that's important because that dovetails with this whole conversation about scale of management. Because in the era, when I think about like the great city building for American cities, I think about the era really from like the 1870s to the 1920s in a lot of ways. Now we can agree or disagree about all that, but it was really a remarkable time period for American cities. Incredible growth, great architecture almost universally. For most cities in America, that's when their most beloved neighborhoods were built. And all of that was done before we had formal planning processes in almost every city where that was being built. And now there was government and there was administration, but it was just an entirely different worldview from what happened when we started changing over to zoning, to how we approached infrastructure and transportation infrastructure in particular. And so it's fascinating for me to try to study and think about that era, which was very localized, versus today, where even local governments feel more like a unit of the national government in implementing whatever policies happen at the national level, as opposed to things that are organically coming out of the local environment.
Yeah. I totally get what you mean when you talk about the greatest, the best few decades of American urbanism, though. Also, that was the period of the most of it. But I don't know. I mean, there's some really. Are there any places that compare to some of our antebellum urbanism? Like, that's pretty awesome.
I mean, Savannah and Charleston, New Orleans, pretty hard to beat.
Yeah. No, but you're right. I see that. And two, I imagine during that period, like at least a little bit of that history I've read, which is not much. There really wasn't even building inspections, and plan review was done by insurance companies rather than municipalities, I think.
Yeah, I think a lot of things were really governed more by lawsuits potentially
Yeah.
between property owners.
Yeah. And it was to qualify for this insurance policy
Mm-hmm.
on your building, you must build to these standards. And the insurance company did the plan review and inspection. If you wanted to have a good insurance rate, otherwise your property insurance rate was much higher. That's my understanding of the birth of building inspections.
Yeah, that sounds right. And a lot of cities started having public water companies in that era, and so
power, gas.
Yeah, and so there were conditions placed on getting like a permit to hook up the water. But there was really effectively nothing on the building side from like a municipal review. So the size of local government was very, very small, generally speaking.
Can I ask you about you? I think you make you alluded to the evolution and emergence of towns and cities, and I think about our places now and in my real estate development work, the residents, that the owners of our property, the idea that one might subdivide a house or subdivide a lot, and tear down a house and subdivide a lot and build two houses, or a different house, in the neighborhood that we built and worked for a long time to secure our own rezoning to be able to build something different. Like that would be terrifying to people. Like, I wonder, what are our prospects for continuing to see our cities, towns, neighborhoods evolve in an organic way that they would have prior to the 20s, 30s, 50s, 70s, depending on when a town implemented these things. I'm wondering when we will see some cool houses that are, in a neighborhood that's gotten extremely valuable, much pricier than it was before. Maybe some single family houses torn down and some 8-unit or 12-unit apartment buildings built on those properties. Like, when are we going to start seeing that happen in these new urbanist or kind of walkable places, mixed use places?
Well, we may not. I think one of the challenges we're in right now is we're eating the fruit of trees that were planted a long time ago. And a couple aspects of that are, one is that we have given everybody essentially through our planning processes a veto power on development. And I always say that whenever you give people an opportunity to say no, they're more likely to say no than yes, because change is scarier than the way things are today. Even if the way things are a mess, change seems scarier.
Right.
So we've given people that idea of veto power. Plus, in addition to that, we have kind of put in place this notion that people, really firmly believe that their neighborhoods really, that there is a certain kind of neighborhood that is a good neighborhood. And that's a neighborhood of only single family homes or largely single family homes. And that anything that departs from that is a problem. And that's been kind of browbeaten into American culture for many decades now. And it's really hard to, I think, get people off of that. And probably the only way that changes is through crisis or poverty, or maybe if Euclid went away and people had to rethink their own local regulations.
And on that topic, everybody go listen to the Yeoman episode with Ilya Soman on the constitutional case against Euclid. So I'm on that point. That's where I was going. I'm actually pretty hopeful. Like, I think you see things like I think I'll probably get the terminology not quite perfect, but the Chevron ruling recently, and then I mean, you hear it from conservative governors, progressive governors, mayors of all stripes, beginning to lament the the challenges of having a prosperous town, city, state in the face of zoning restrictions, and then you also, I think there's or I know people are trying to mount cases to challenge the Euclid versus Ambler 1926 ruling, and if not overturn it, then meaningfully neuter it. I mean, we could see that.
I actually spoke to a group of planners last week about that possibility, and I think they were shocked that like people were even talking about that. They were completely unaware.
When did you begin your career in urbanism, real estate?
I graduated from college in '94.
Yeah.
And I worked as an architect for several years, and then started my own firm in 2000, and did that for about 10 years before moving to Savannah.
I didn't know you lived in Savannah.
Lived in Savannah for almost 9 years.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Well, then we've been in the field for a similar amount of time. Like, can you imagine in 1998 people talking about, there being people seriously considering what it might look like to end zoning or meaningfully reform transportation policy or those sorts of things? Like, those were crazy people talking, not governors of states.
Right. Yeah, I know that was not even part of the lexicon at all in that era. And so there has been a lot of movement in that. Mm-hmm. And there's been more attention to like the Houston model in recent years than I ever remember. I remember going to architecture school and people openly mocking Houston because they were so dumb. They're the only city who didn't adopt zoning. And now you actually have serious discussion from thoughtful people about how they manage their process without zoning. Yeah. And saying, you know what, maybe this is actually a pretty good model.
Well, and of course, people will throw up Houston as the example. And Houston has only had meaningful reform in the last, 7 or 8 years. It hasn't been a long time. But people will be like, oh, Houston had no zoning, and that's what you get a lot of auto dependency without zoning. I'm like, well, Houston did have minimum lot size requirements. They had giant setbacks. Like, they didn't have exclusionary use requirements, but they still had zoning-ish stuff. They had zoning-like things. And then even when they started peeling those things back, half a dozen years or so ago, things got really good, really affordable, and they're on a great trajectory now.
Yeah. And they still operate within the same model of transportation and infrastructure funding. Yeah. And so it's kind of hard to disconnect those two.
Right. Yeah.
But it is a model to think about that's pretty interesting, that really puts the power more directly in the hands of residents as to like how much change they're willing to accept or not. And then what are the trade-offs and deal with those trade-offs. So from that standpoint, it's really fascinating.
Can I turn a little bit to Kansas City? Are you from Kansas City? Where are you from?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a long and winding story. My dad's family is from this area. Our particular family moved around a lot as children. My dad worked in a meatpacking company on the management side, and so every time he wanted a promotion, we had to move to a different town. Mm-hmm. And so we were always in the Midwest, but we lived in a whole bunch of different places. And people actually used to think we were a military family because of the amount of that we moved. But really, Kansas City was always home for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've spent a little bit of time in Kansas City, enough time to feel like I would like to spend more time there. But give me the picture of Kansas City. Like, what's, population, big industries, leadership of the city, types of people that are there, so forth.
Well, as a metro area, it's like just over 2 million people. And it's like a lot of Midwestern metros. It's always been kind of a slow and steady growth mode. and with a very diverse industrial or economic base. So we had a lot of heavy industry. We still have some. We have a lot of agriculture. We have some tech. We have finance. We have, various corporate headquarters, Hallmark cards, Garmin, if you're familiar with Garmin, who does all the radar devices. There you go.
Yeah, I got my Garmin right here.
There you go. So, and so we have a lot of federal government. We're a federal government regional headquarters too, and so we have a branch of the Fed that's here. And,
yeah, there's a lot of ways you're similar to Atlanta.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because our major boom cycle was the 1880s through the 1930s, I would say. And in that period of time, which was actually as for an American city, that was a fantastic time to have your boom cycle. So we have incredible historic resources from that era. We had great architecture. We were very big into the City Beautiful movement.
Yeah, that was my impression in the little time I've been there. I was like, whoa, this is really beautiful. There's so much great urban fabric here.
Yeah. So, and like a lot of cities, we tore a lot of it down with freeways and urban renewal, but there's still a lot of it left. And the city lies at the junction of two major rivers, the Missouri River and the Kansas River, or the Kaw, depending on what you want to call it. And so we have a whole lot more topography than most people would think of for a Midwestern city. But that I always like to say, for that period of time, we were like the boom city of the Western United States. Kansas City was. Anybody that was going west came through Kansas City.
Right.
And so this was a great city for jazz, among other things, because anything that was a big thing being created in that era, we had that. And then following that era and following World War II, we probably adopted the urban sprawl car-oriented model as much as any city in the world. And so we're an incredibly spread out metropolitan area and city.
And the surrounding area is really flat too, right?
It depends which direction you go. I would say it's less flat than probably most people would think. You really don't get the really flat stuff in this area until you get towards like central Kansas, where it gets very, very flat. We have a lot more kind of like rolling hills and everything else. So, and we have a region where we have a lot of big lakes and everything else. Lake of the Ozarks, which has gotten a lot more famous in recent years, is not far away. But it's a fascinating. The interesting thing for me is that like people from Kansas City have always been kind of proud of this place, and I joke a lot with my wife now. She gives me crap about this because she's not from here. We met in Savannah. She's actually not from Savannah. She grew up in Maine, but we met in Savannah. And then we moved back here like 6 years ago. And she says it's like the weirdest thing. People walk around Kansas City with Kansas City shirts on and KC shirts on all the time, or shirts or hats or whatever.
Yeah.
Like in most cities, those are the tourists. But there's always been that sense, I think, of civic pride here. And then we've just had so much success with our sports teams the last decade that it's only enhanced that. So it from a development and design standpoint, I would say we've always been a city that has incredible historic assets. We went through an awful period where we lost and tore down a lot, and we went away from that. We've started to rediscover that in the last 15 or 20 years. But we are still just scratching the surface on where I think the urban part of the city could be, and what its potential is. And we are finally, after many years, some of the suburban jurisdictions have really come around to understanding that they could even do more with their development patterns. And they've had a lot of success. A lot of the suburban cities have done great with little downtowns and other things. So it's an interesting time to be here. That's for sure. We have more national attention than I would have ever imagined we would have.
Well, I imagine that version of that story you can tell about a lot of American cities, but there are a lot of things about that sound to me like Atlanta.
Yeah.
Right now.
And the wild thing is, if you go back to like, I think 1950 or so, I think we were a bigger city than Atlanta.
Oh yeah.
Atlanta's obviously exploded, since then. But
yeah,
if I were,
it surprised me.
Yeah. I mean,
Atlanta was a pretty sleepy place until
air conditioning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have not listened to this episode yet, but you have some time ago, if I'm remembering this correctly, you have a post about, or an episode about kind of the I don't know if I'm remembering this term correctly, but the term I would use would be like a city's dashboard. Like, what are the big things you need to be paying, like the big things that should be really important to a city. We talk about that some. I think a lot. I have this running sort of spreadsheet where I'm like, what would be if I were the mayor, city manager, on the city council, town council, whatever, what would be on my dashboard? Like, what would be the things I would want to be paying attention to?
That's a great question. I started talking about that. I wanted to do that one because I just think they're like so many things, people who like to call themselves urbanists, we get locked into our own little bubble. Mm-hmm. And some of it's an ideological bubble and some of it's just a experience bubble. And I think it's so easy for us to forget what it is that most people really value about a place that they live in, or why they choose a place, mm-hmm. what's important to them, and what a city government should prioritize. And so obviously we love the traditional city and town and the human aspect of that, the walking aspect of that. And I wish everybody valued that highly. But the reality is most people don't value that as much as they value other things. So some of this is a point of discussion because there are things here that my city is just not very good at. And so it's top of mind. And so, public safety is right at the top. The reality is, I heard somebody else say not long ago, like, we have local government for law and order. That's why we have local government, period. That's why we created them. And a lot of cities, especially big cities, are not good at maintenance of law and order in their communities, especially right now. And then beyond that, like, especially for people who have children, the quality and kinds of schools are top of the list. That's really, really important in terms of where people choose to live. And so I kind of think of it like safety and schools are really at about the top, and then cost of living is in there, probably in the mix as well. Is this an expensive community? Are the taxes really high? Are mm-hmm. they low? Those are kinds of things that most, quote unquote, normal people really value. And instead we get a lot of cities that focus on, 20 different issues instead of trying to, at their foundation, doing the basic things really, really well. And so if we kind of circle back around to where we started a little bit, the experience that I've had in the last few years working in place management has really helped me get a deeper understanding into why some of these things work or don't work in big cities. Mm-hmm. And I used to always have this suspicion back to my consulting days when I consulted with communities of all sizes. I had this kind of sneaking suspicion that smaller cities were better managed. But I couldn't really understand or articulate why. And it also sounds kind of crazy, right? Because most people think like small towns, small cities, well, their staff isn't as smart as people in the big cities. They don't have all they just don't have everything figured out. They're always operating, on a shoestring, and
they don't have enough scale to support, right. Different kinds of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was always true that, like, almost all my best municipal clients when I consulted were smaller cities. They were the ones willing to experiment and were able to execute things very quickly. And the big cities were the ones where it was so hard to just, even get modest change accomplished through policy or whatever. And working in place management and then being part of this world has really helped me see, how, especially in large municipalities, how siloed everything becomes and how distant the end users are from the policymakers and the people who work in government, and how that how that creates this enormous breakdown in being able to handle basic things really well. So, I'll give you an example. So like we've had a terrible experience the last few years with crime in our part of town. It's it's been brutal. And so we started doing some things just the last 6 months to really dive in and figure out, where we can have an impact. And one of the things that we're doing is we just started doing monthly meetings. We've just had 2 of these now where we get everybody around the table just to focus on our part of town. So the police department, the prosecutor's offices, our district staff, a key liaison from city government. And we're actually identifying, specific issues and people to kind of deal with in our part of town. It's remarkable that like this sort of thing just doesn't happen. Mm. And most people would think this is not rocket science. This is just like basics of good management and governance, that if you have, 4 different organizations or departments that impact a problem, you get them all together and you put your heads together and you work it out together. And unfortunately, and so I guess my point of all that would be, in small towns, smaller cities, that happens naturally because they're small.
Yeah.
Because people have to work together.
And it happens to a degree by osmosis, like without kind of a deliberate effort to have it happen.
Exactly. And you have a situation in smaller communities where the residents and the business people, they actually know who those people are, whether it's their mayor or council people or the city staff people. It's not hard to figure out who they are. And the bigger the city gets, the more siloed everybody becomes. And there's just like less and less of an impulse to try to work together with people in the other silos.
I imagine that's both bigger population wise and geographic area, both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That totally translates to, half of my professional careers in real estate, urbanism, land development. The other half is in software and building software businesses. And it totally translates to building a company as well. The things that startups are really good at, nimbleness, like not have a lot of infrastructure relating to communication. People get it, like common cause, those sorts of things enable them to move really quickly in directions. And then, the way to lead or to affect change in a business that's under 25 employees is really different than what you need to do at 100 employees or at 500 employees. All those things change dramatically. Like as you grow, without putting an enormous amount of effort in, the leadership's job becomes more and more about ensuring that everybody is operating with common understanding and common vision, because those things just happen naturally in a small place. Mm-hmm. Are there any, you will know much better than me, but are there any big cities that are extremely well run? I was probably a little too young to be paying attention to it, but I was early in my career, but just because he's been so involved in New Urbanism, I think of John Norquist. Mm-hmm. But I think of him as a great guy, mayor of Milwaukee for a time. I think of him as someone who was, highly respected, and that's a larger city. Can you think of any?
I I mean, I don't want to be uncharitable, but I just don't see it. I haven't seen it. There are unique periods of time when you get a particularly strong mayor who has the ability in their city, maybe with a strong mayor system, to implement things.
There's for listeners, there's a strong mayor and a weak mayor system.
Right.
And there's also term limits in cities with term limits and not term limits. But under a weak mayor system, which is very common, like Atlanta has a weak mayor system, the mayor is essentially a tie-breaking vote on the council.
Right.
They're a leader. They chart a course and do those sorts of things. But in a strong mayor system, the mayor has a huge amount of influence over policy. It's a bit less democratized. Is that a good description? Is that
absolutely. It's the weak mayor system, or what a lot of people call the council manager form of government. The mayor is often just kind of one vote on that council. And there's probably there's varying levels of responsibilities. Some cities give more responsibilities to the mayor beyond that. Like in our city, we're the council manager form of government, but in our city, the mayor has the ability to appoint people to boards and commissions solely. Right. So there's some power with that. But for the most part, that's very different than like a strong mayor system where the mayor can actually hire senior staff directly when they're elected, and which really is a more democratic impulse to government, because then you have a direct ratification on whether that mayor is doing a good job or not.
Yeah.
So the council manager system, like a lot of systems we had with the civil service, was kind of put in place in theory to reduce corruption and have professional management of cities. But just like the civil service at the federal level, it's created other problems, not the least of which is a lot of the staff of cities are just not very responsive to the needs or transparent about what's going on.
Yeah.
And there's very little ability for the elected officials to impact that, to hire and fire people, to make sure that their priorities are actually implemented. And so it's a challenge, man. The more I work with the council manager form of government, which is what I've seen in most of my professional career, the less I like it.
And I confess to, when I think of the mayors were the cities that I perceive to be extremely well-run towns. They do tend to be smaller, but I actually don't know if they're strong mayor or council manager form. Like, I think about Greenville, South Carolina, and Mayor Knox White, who's been mayor for like 40 years or something. That's just anybody who runs against him has no chance, because he's so beloved. I think you had that type of thing going on in Chattanooga. You had it in Charleston for a long time until they were retired. And actually, for some of those cities, I actually don't know. But I know they're smaller towns, or not. Charleston's not tiny, Greenville's not tiny, but they're manageable sized towns. Do you think it's? I don't want to put words in your mouth. Do you think it's both the structure of governance and the size, or do you think you can have one? Elaborate on that.
That's a really, really good question. I do think both have an impact. I think one of the things that I've come around to over the years is, like, if I could wave a magic wand, I would have no governing units bigger than like 50,000 people.
Like in ancient Greece, what was the biggest?
I don't know.
It was a lot smaller than 50,000. They were tiny.
Yeah. Well, and even if you go back to our Constitution, there actually were numbers prescribed for the House of Representatives that I think it was around 27,000 people that they didn't want any district to be.
Oh, I don't know that. Yeah.
Bigger. Yeah. I mean, it was actually, there's a number specified in there. That's pretty fascinating. So they gave a lot of thought to that issue, which we've completely blown past, obviously. But I would love to see a lot of our cities broken down into much smaller units, because I think they would just be so much more effective at the basics. there would be a whole lot better relationship between the citizens and their government. And in a lot of ways, I think it would restore faith in good governance for a lot of people. In a lot of big cities, not only are the basics handled pretty poorly, it's also the taxation is much higher. And there's just kind of a lot of apathy on the part of the citizens about their ability to do anything about it.
I don't want to be I'll bellyache a little bit, but I've made effort here in the city of Atlanta because I don't feel like I should be complaining without trying to affect positive change. And it's a whole lot harder to affect some positive change in the city of Atlanta than in our, the place where we have a place in the North Carolina mountains, and then in that little community.
Yeah.
A thing that I just on the governance side that speaks to your point about scale and size, and like, it's hard to get a clear answer from a human about something in Atlanta city government. It can be very hard.
Yeah.
And can take a long time. And I got a tax bill for our property in the mountains, and I picked up the phone when it was like 4:45 on a Friday, and I'm like, well, I have it in front of me. I'm going to try to resolve this right now. It was unclear to me what I was supposed to do. And I picked up the phone and called the Jackson County, tax commissioner's office, and first ring, 4:45 Friday, someone picks up the phone. Hello, this is Jane, or, I can't remember her name, which is embarrassing that I can't. I'm like, oh, hey, Jane, this is Geoff Graham. I received I own some property in Jackson County, and I received this letter about my tax bill. It was just like, it was unclear to me if I was supposed to do something, or anyway, can you connect me with someone that can help me with that? And she's like, oh, I can help you with that. I'm like, oh, great. Like, well, here's my letter. And she said, you're Geoff with a G, right? I was like, yeah. How'd you know that? She's like, I just remembered your name. Oh, and I was like, holy cow. And, finished the conversation in 5 minutes and was done. And I hung up the phone, and I was thinking, and, people who listen to this show will probably know this, that I'm on the spectrum of libertarianism, probably closer to an anarchist. And I was like, wow, if 100% of my interactions with the government were like that, I don't know that I'd be a libertarian.
Yeah, there's no doubt. There's a lot.
Yeah.
The more you encounter dysfunction in especially larger government, the more it pushes you to just being a libertarian about all of it.
Yeah, I had a related story. Years ago, I had the great opportunity that a bunch of business owners, like 30 or 40 small business owners, were able to meet with our mayor at the time, Mayor Kasim Reed of the city of Atlanta. And we talked about a whole bunch of things, and I raised some questions with him, trying to be constructive about opportunities I saw that the city could embrace to improve. And Mayor Reed, who's a bit of he's a hard charger. Like he did a bunch of, and he has, I think, a bunch of fans and a bunch of critics, but he was a hard charger, no doubt. After I raised these issues to him, he's a big guy, and he got this sort of sad hangdog look, and he's like, I tell you, Mr. Graham, to solve that problem, I'd need to be able to fire a bunch of people, and I just can't do it. I wish I had a good answer for you. And anyway, I just think those two things, my interaction with Jane in Jackson County versus my interaction with the mayor of the city of Atlanta, is a bit of a tale of two cities.
Yeah. And unfortunately, most people don't even get to have that kind of conversation.
Totally. Right. Yeah. I mean, I was lucky to that was a special thing to be able to do.
Yeah. And the dynamic is so weird and unfortunate because also there's a lot of people who work in city government that I deal with who are pretty fantastic people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do our job and really sharp, really dedicated. A lot of those people tend to just end up moving on into private sector or something else. And I think there's tremendous frustration within those systems, not just outside of them. And I just don't think it generally talk enough about the issue of scale and how that impacts the relationship people have with whatever their unit of government is.
I agree with you. Yeah.
And it also, so that's where it kind of came back to the schools issue as well, because, I've lived in places when I was in Savannah, most of the counties in Georgia, I think they have county-wide school districts. And so in Savannah and Chatham County, the public school district was the whole county. So you've got enormous amounts of students and teachers and administrators and everything else. And it's just a crazy thing as a parent. How do you impact that system? You have a school board, obviously, but the school board is such a different job operating a school district with, let's say, 100,000 kids in it versus one that has, 10,000 kids or 5,000 kids. And the interaction that a parent has is so incredibly different, or almost non-existent in the bigger ones. And so there's an issue of the scale of the district itself, and then the issue of scale as relates to the schools themselves and how big the actual school gets.
Yeah. They are. I'm try to be hopeful about things. It does seem to me like this question of scale, of human scale, of ideas around subsidiarity, they are much more talked about today than 10 years ago, or maybe I'm just paying attention to them more. I think Nassim Taleb has done a great deal to write about this topic. I think there's renewed interest in authors who were writing about these topics in the early part or the middle part of the last century. I think in the 70s, Kirk Sale published Human Scale. We're coming up on getting close to the 50th anniversary of that book, and people are. I am hearing reference to these ideas more and more, and I even think as a child at the South, I think that we're now where maybe we have enough time where we can look back on the question of subsidiarity and local governance, and put and try and look at like where, in what ways is it good to have states or cities or city states or counties have greater authority than a more distant ruler, where those conversations were harder to have 50 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. And I agree. I mean, I think there's definitely more interest in this topic. Generally, I see it in a few more places than I used to before. And I think we're in a period of time where enough people are recognizing that there are just huge issues in how we manage our local governments in particular. And no matter what your ideological approach is, or what side of the aisle you come from, more and more people are recognizing that we don't do the basic things very well in American cities. And why is that? It's not like we lack resources. It's not like we're stupid.
The most basic being safety, cleanliness, and perhaps basic utilities and infrastructure and schools, probably, where that is is that what you mean?
I think that, and then certainly what's happened with the housing affordability issues over the last couple of decades has highlighted to people that we're also completely missing the mark on just the basics of development and housing people. So
it does seem to me a great time to be if you're a small town or mid-sized town that has some great urban fabric and you're not too terribly far from a good airport, it seems like a really good time.
Yeah, no doubt.
Like you have a lot of talented people wanting to either return home who left, or to make that place your home. You have the opportunity to learn from mistakes of your larger cousins and your larger cities nearby. I feel like I see like Perry, Georgia, or Clayton, Georgia, or much more mature Greenville and Chattanooga. Those places, they've certainly benefited from that. I have concern about cities. Like, how are cities going to fix this? Because if the two of us can't point to a major city that's well governed, that has good governance infrastructure, that's kind of foreboding.
It is, and if we go back to, I remember some of the early New Urbanist presentations that Andreas would give, where he would talk about, if you went, this was in the 1990s, it's even more stark today, but if you went to Berlin, Tokyo, and Detroit, you would think that we had lost the war, and the Axis powers had won the war, judging by the physical realities of their cities.
Yeah.
And I just don't think it's crazy to go around American cities. Obviously, every American city nowadays has some portion of it that's really nice and wonderful, and things are well kept, and there's vibrancy. But it's not hard to find massive areas that seem third worldish, and where the basics are just not being handled well. And so I think it's a great time to kind of evaluate that and try to ask really, really hard questions about why that is and what we can do about it.
I think your observation that scale of governance and the distance between the constituency and the official is a really, that seems to me to be an obvious and important one. And perhaps if we really drill into that question, if there's one question we were to drill into and try and address, maybe a deep exploration of that one is going to bear a great deal of fruit for our cities.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, that's something that I'm really interested in. And if I ever can create more time in my life, I'd like to dig into more and write more about. But I really think it's fundamental to making a lot of the. I have this problem as a Midwestern guy. I'm extraordinarily practical. I can't get that out of my head. It's like I want things to just work. I want things to work well, no matter what, and it drives me crazy when they don't. And so I think just getting back to understanding how do we get things so that people feel like the basics are actually done and done well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin, thank you for joining me on Yeoman. It's been really great to have you. And let me get, so the Messy Cities podcast, I want y'all to check that out. Who are your guests that you have lined up for Messy Cities?
Let's see. I just did one with a local, smaller scale developer that'll come out in about a week and a half. I tapped also, there's a Twitter account of somebody that just caught my attention recently that talks a lot about courtyard urbanism. And I thought it was really interesting content she was putting up, and I reached out to her, and I'm going to, Alicia Peterson, I think is her name, going to have her on. But I really like talking to smaller scale developers. Yeah.
You have a bunch about the practicalities of real estate development. You have some great stuff about that. I have a bias that I really would love to get, especially more young architects and planners, into the development business. I think there's just so much benefit from doing that for themselves and for everybody. So I like to kind of cross this world between people who build things, people who plan, like really good planners and designers, and then just good thinkers who think about cities and walkable cities and what all we can do. So that's kind of the area I try to inhabit. Well, you're doing great work, and your Substack is not Messy Cities. It is Kevin Klink. Is that right?
It's my Twitter account is Kevin Klink. The Substack is actually the Messy City.
Okay, the Messy City. Yeah. All right. Well, great to be with you, Kevin.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you, and say hi to your brother Vince as well.
So. Roger that. I will.